Imagine traveling back 15,000 years. You are about 5.5 feet tall, you weigh 150 pounds, and you are armed with a sharp rock tied to a stick. Your dinner is a woolly mammoth, a 10-foot-tall, 6-ton animal covered in thick fur, with a hide like armor and tusks that could impale you without much effort. How exactly do you make that work? This is one of those questions that seems impossible until you actually look at the evidence. We have all seen the cartoons and movies where cavemen throw spears at mammoths and somehow bring them down. But the reality is way more interesting and, honestly, way more terrifying. So let us talk about how prehistoric humans actually hunted mammoths. It turns out they were not just lucky, they were smart. First, let us establish what we are dealing with here. A woolly mammoth was not just big, it was massive. We are talking 4 to 8 tons, averaging around 6 tons. Males stood 9 to 11 feet tall at the shoulder. For reference, that is about the size of a modern African elephant, except covered in shaggy fur and adapted to survive Ice Age winters. They had thick hide underneath all that fur, and then a 3-inch layer of insulating fat beneath that. Trying to kill one of these things with primitive weapons was not just dangerous, it was borderline suicidal if you did not know what you were doing. And yet, humans did it, regularly. We have the evidence. Archaeological sites across North America, Europe, and Asia show that mammoths were a significant part of the prehistoric diet. One burial site in Montana showed that mammoths made up 35 to 40% of one individual's diet based on isotope analysis. These were not occasional lucky kills. This was a reliable food source. So how did they pull it off? Let's start with the tools. The most famous are Clovis points, these distinctive stone spear tips that show up all over North America from about 13,400 to 12,700 years ago. Clovis points are beautiful pieces of engineering. They are typically 3 to 5 inches long, made from flint, chert, or jasper, and they have distinctive grooves called fluting at the base. That fluting was not decorative. It served a specific purpose in how the point attached to the shaft and in how it behaved on impact. Here is what is wild. These points were designed to break in a very specific way. When a Clovis point hit its target, it was engineered to fracture and spread inside the wound, similar to a hollow point bullet. The idea was not to have a reusable spear. It was to create maximum internal damage with a single strike. This tells us something important. These were not primitive people throwing random sharp rocks at animals. They understood materials, physics, and wound mechanics. They were engineers. But there's a problem with the Hollywood version of mammoth hunting, and it's a big one. For years, the assumption was that hunters threw these spears at mammoths. Makes sense, right? That's what you see in every museum diorama and nature documentary. Except there's a problem. Humans can't throw hard enough. Recent research in 2024 has completely upended this idea. Scientists tested whether a human could throw a Clovis-tipped spear with enough force to penetrate mammoth hide. The answer? Not even close. Think about it. You're trying to punch through thick fur, tough hide, and 3 inches of fat. A thrown spear just does not have enough kinetic energy. Even our best modern athletes, using optimal technique, could not generate the force needed. And prehistoric humans were not exactly training at the gym. So if they were not throwing the spears, what were they doing? Here's where it gets interesting, and frankly, way more terrifying than the Hollywood version. They planted the spears in the ground. That's right. Instead of throwing the spear at the mammoth, they braced it against the ground at an angle, point up, and let the mammoth impale itself. Picture this. You're part of a hunting group. Your job is to hold your ground, plant your spear at the right angle, brace the shaft against the earth, and wait while a 6-ton animal charges directly at you. If you planted it right, the mammoth runs into the point, and its own weight and momentum drive the spear deep into its body. If you did not plant it right, or if you panic and run, you have just wasted one of your group's precious spears. Or worse, you get trampled. This is called pike hunting, and it requires nerves of absolute steel. The physics make sense. A charging mammoth generates way more force than a thrown spear ever could. By letting the animal impale itself, you are using its own mass and speed against it. The hunters were not trying to overpower the mammoth. They were redirecting its power into a killing blow. But this also explains something else: why Clovis points were designed to break apart. When a 6-ton mammoth slams into your planted spear, something is going to give. Better the spear tip than your arms. The point breaks open, creating massive internal damage, while the wooden shaft absorbs some of the impact. It's not a bug, it's a feature. Pike hunting was not the only technique. In 2019, archaeologists in Mexico discovered something remarkable. 14 mammoths in hand dug pits near Mexico City. These were not natural pits. Humans had dug them, about 5.5 feet deep and 82 feet across. That is a massive engineering project for people working with primitive tools. But here is the clever part. They were used over and over again for 500 years. The hunting strategy was coordinated. A group of 20 to 30 people would use fire, torches, and branches to separate individual mammoths from the herd. Once isolated, they would drive the mammoth toward the pit. The animal falls in, cannot climb out, and the hunters finish it off from above. This method was safer than pike hunting. You are not betting your life on perfect timing and nerve, but it required serious planning, cooperation, and knowledge of mammoth behavior. You had to know where herds traveled, when they would be in the area, and how to manipulate their movement without getting the entire herd to charge you. The Mexico site also showed something else interesting. Ritual arrangements of mammoth bones appeared after the hunt. This was not just survival. It had cultural and possibly spiritual significance. These were people with complex beliefs, not mere scavengers trying to survive. One thing both techniques had in common: you could not do this alone. Mammoth hunting required coordination. People to scout and track, people to drive or separate the animals, people to position the pikes or manage the pit trap, people to finish off the wounded animal, people to process the carcass. This was a community endeavor, and it required social organization that went far beyond what we usually imagine for cavemen. They had to communicate complex plans, assign roles, trust each other with their lives, and distribute the rewards fairly or risk the group falling apart. Think about the pike hunting scenario. You're standing there with a planted spear while a mammoth charges. The only reason you are not running is because you trust the people around you to do their jobs. If one person panics and breaks formation, everyone is in danger. That is not primitive behavior. That is military-level discipline. Okay, but here is the obvious question. Why bother? Why risk getting trampled by a 6-ton animal when you could hunt deer or rabbits or anything else less likely to kill you? The answer is simple: payoff. One mammoth represented an enormous amount of resources. The meat alone could feed a community for weeks or even months. But it was not just about the meat. The bones made excellent tools, knives, scrapers, and sewing needles. Mammoth ribs were used to butcher meat. The tusks could be carved into tools or art. The hides and fur made clothing and shelter. And in Ice Age conditions, good insulation was the difference between life and death. There is even evidence that people built entire structures using mammoth bones as the framework. Some parts were considered delicacies, Analysis suggests organs and tongues were prized. Nothing went to waste because groups could not afford to lose any part. So yes, hunting a mammoth was dangerous, but the return on investment was massive. One successful hunt could set up a group for an entire season. That was worth the risk when people were living on the edge of survival in an Ice Age landscape. Here is something interesting. Clovis culture, the people who made those distinctive spear points, only existed for 300 years. This roughly coincides with the extinction of North American megafauna. Mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, and saber-toothed cats all disappeared. Scientists still debate how much human hunting contributed to these extinctions versus climate change, but the timing is hard to ignore. What we do know is that humans were incredibly effective mammoth hunters, maybe too effective. Recent analysis of Clovis points found blood residue from mammoths and mastodons, confirming these were not just ceremonial items. They were actively used as hunting weapons. The fact that these specialized hunters appeared, thrived for a few centuries, then disappeared right as their primary prey went extinct, tells us how dependent they had become on megafauna hunting. So here is your answer. How did humans hunt 6-ton mammoths 15,000 years ago? Well, not by being stronger, but by being smarter. They planted spears in the ground and let the mammoth impale itself, redirecting 6 tons of force into a killing blow. They dug massive pit traps and used them for centuries. They coordinated in groups of 20 to 30 people, each with specialized roles, trusting each other with their lives. Standing your ground while a mammoth charges takes a kind of courage that is hard to imagine today. Next time you see a museum exhibit with a caveman throwing a spear at a mammoth, you will know better. The real story is way more impressive. These were people who looked at a 6-ton Ice Age beast and thought, yes, we can take that. And then they actually did it. That is not primitive. That is just human. If you enjoyed spending these last few minutes with me, please subscribe. It really helps this small channel grow, and I truly appreciate it.